On April 9th, 1898, Paul Leroy Robeson was born to Reverend William Drew Robeson and Maria Louisa Bustillo. The Robeson family was ethnically mixed, but very obviously didn't look like it. Growing up, Paul would get an affinity for being outspoken, filling in for his dad as a preacher, as well as acting and singing while in school. He would also excel in various sports. After graduating as valedictorian, he would enroll in Rutgers University, continuing his extracurriculars, even as his father would become gravely ill, passing away not that long afterwards, which led to Paul to start thinking about something: racial discrimination. He was no better or worse than the other students in his university, and yet he couldn't join the Glee Club because membership meant attending parties that he literally couldn't go to. When his school was to play football against Washington and Lee, he was benched because the opponents refused to play if he did, and black men were being asked to put their lives on the line for the US in the so-called Great War, and yet would return to get the same treatment that they had before. After graduating Rutgers, he would attend NYU School of Law, taking jobs in coaching and playing football, but would soon move to Harlem and begin to go to school there, meeting a woman by the name of Eslanda Good, who egged him to pursue a career as a stage actor, wedding her in 1921 and finally graduating college in 1923. While he tried to get a career in law, he had one major problem. Everybody was racist, so he would pursue acting full-time while his wife would support him, getting his first big role as Jim in All God's Chillin' Got Wings, a play about miscegenation, but due to the plot, the play would be delayed, with the director giving Robeson the chance to play a different role in a separate production called The Emperor Jones, and not just any role. He would play the titular Emperor Brutus Jones, which led to Robeson getting tons of praise for, shooting him up to the top echelons of Hollywood, his wife even quitting her job to become his agent full-time, landing the lead part in Oscar Michau's race film, Body and Soul. While Paul's career was rising, his son Paul Jr. would be born in 1927. 1 year later, Robeson would play the part of Joe in the London production of Showboat, which earned him friendships with members of Parliament. But despite this, he was still refused seating on the bus based on his race. Meanwhile, tensions were forming back at home, with Essie discovering Paul's extramarital affairs, leading her to edit his biography to make him look bad, as well as filing for divorce. However, for various reasons, the two decided to stick it out, deciding to try and remain in London as there was a lack of a racial problem there. Soon afterwards, Robeson would get the role of a lifetime, Othello, being the first black actor to play him since 1833. The same year, he would star in the film adaptation of The Emperor Jones, the first time a black actor had a lead in a major theatrical film. And as Robeson started getting more famous, he started becoming a lot more open about his African roots, rejecting Central European opera roles because he had no connection to the material, and also started to learn Swahili in his spare time. The year afterwards, he played the role of Bosambo in The Sanders of the River, which many saw as not quite the role he seemed like he wanted, so he would then make the choice to be a bit more critical of the roles that he took, only taking roles that portrayed black people in a positive light, such as playing Toussaint Louverture in the eponymous play written by C.L.R. James. His connections to a lot of prominent British socialists led him to get a ticket to the USSR, and once he arrived, Robeson was quoted as saying, "Here, I am not a Negro, but a human being for the first time in my life. I walk in full human dignity," which would begin his political radicalization. The first thing that made Paul shift leftward was the rise of fascism, particularly in Germany and Spain. Robeson actively getting involved in the Republican cause, using his concerts to openly support them, as well as heading to Spain to help boost morale. He would also invite Jawaharlal Nehru to discuss Indian independence, who explained that imperialism and fascism were inherently linked, which led to Robeson to reevaluate his career, shooting his last British film in 1939, returning to the United States, being a part of the Ballot for Americans, which made his star power in the States rise to the point where
Collier
called him America's #1 entertainer. But that wouldn't last, given the film he made was a documentary about union busting that was labeled communist propaganda by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with the next film that he got involved with apparently being so racist that Paul would announce that he would quit acting altogether to focus purely on the activism aspect of his life. Speaking of, Robeson also got some eyes when the US intelligence agency noticed that when the USSR entered a deal with the Nazis, Robeson argued against African Americans supporting a war in Europe, but once the deal broke through, he argued that an Allied defeat would make slaves of us all.
Coincidentally, the exact same viewpoint espoused by the American Communist Party at the behest of the Soviet Union. More info here.
After the war ended, Robeson would try to influence domestic affairs, getting thrown out of Truman's office after arguing that he needed to enact an anti-lynching bill, forming the American Crusade Against Lynching in 1946, which led to Robeson being called to Congress to be asked if he was a communist, where he would basically dodge the question, but I think most people already knew what the answer was, which seemingly got more noticeable when Paul would not only support the presidential campaign of Henry Wallace, but also publicly defended Communist Party leaders who were being tried under the Smith Act, which led to the United States to try and demonize Paul Robeson, not only canceling all of his concerts in America, but also blatantly lying about him when he was gone, the Associated Press claiming that Paul stated that the US was a fascist state. Speaking of, Robeson would end up traveling to Moscow during said tours, and he would try to meet up with an ally of his, Itzik Pfeffer and Solomon Mikols, leaders of the Soviet faction of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. There was just one problem. Solomon was dead, and Pfeffer was in jail, seemingly next in line, but the USSR tried to paint this in a more positive light, allowing Robeson to see him whenever he wanted, with Pfeffer pleading with Paul to help him because he knew what was coming, and Robeson tried to initiate private methods to save him, but publicly made the claim that the purges that were going on were not happening, even making a speech to the Paris Peace Conference talking about peace with the USSR, which infuriated the USA even more so. So to discredit him, the House Un-American Activities Committee subpoenaed baseball player Jackie Robinson to comment on this part of his speech as reported by the Associated Press. We colonial peoples have contributed to the building of the United States, and we are determined to share its wealth. We denounce the policy of the United States government, which is similar to Hitler and Goebbels. It is unthinkable that American Negroes would go to war on behalf of those who have oppressed us for generations against the Soviet Union, which in one generation has lifted our people to full human dignity, which led to Robinson stating that Robeson's statements, if accurately reported, were silly, which led to a separate statement by Eleanor Roosevelt. Mr. Robeson does his people great harm in trying to line them up on the communist side of the political picture. Jackie Robinson helps them greatly by his forthright statements, which would lead to controversy when Robeson was slated to give a concert in New York City, with many not wanting to have the traitor in their city, leading to massive riots preventing him from commencing with his concert. But this is where I'm going to have to remind you all of something. Remember what Jackie Robinson said. If accurately reported. Well, they weren't reported accurately, with it turning out that the speech that the AP printed in the US was just a jumbled mix of different speeches that Robeson stated that were out of context, which made him look significantly worse. But it seems it was too late, as Paul was being blacklisted for his views, with a 1949 Almanac of College Athletes completely ignoring his existence, and him not being allowed to defend himself on Eleanor Roosevelt's TV show as per NBC's request. But it seems the biggest nail in the coffin for Paul was when he denounced the Korean War, both claiming the US and the UN intervening was imperialist, while China intervening was morally just to defend the Korean people, with the US responding by demanding that Paul return his passport, and when he refused, they revoked it anyways. thus essentially locking him in the United States, which made his income drop from $150,000 to $3,000. When Robeson asked the State Department why this was happening, they responded simply, his frequent criticisms of the treatment of blacks in the United States should not be aired in foreign countries. Robeson would try to continue his activism, starting a paper called Freedom alongside W.E.B. Du Bois, where he would publish columns every week.
While the paper shut down in 1955, the two would also release a joint statement in 1956 praising the Soviet invasion of Hungary, comparing the Hungarian revolutionaries to the, quote, people who overthrew the Spanish Republican government, unquote.
Meanwhile, the US were printing some columns of their own, having 2 articles written in the NAACP's official paper denouncing Robeson to be distributed in Africa, i.e. an area that still liked Robeson. Outside of activism, Robeson still tried to continue his career, albeit with significantly less press. Eventually, Robeson was called to the House Un-American Activities Committee because they wanted him to answer a very specific question. Are you a communist? With Robeson responding by simply invoking his Fifth Amendment rights, which led to all of Robeson's films and songs to be removed from circulation. While he still did occasional concerts and still talked about politics, Robeson started getting noticeably less vocal. While still confined to the United States, he would publish a manifesto/biography called Here I Stand, which was treated as if it never existed, papers in the US just flat out refusing to acknowledge it. Robeson's passport would be reinstated after the Kent v. Dulles case, to which Robeson would immediately begin a European tour, starring in another Othello production, speaking publicly about the plight of the Maori and Aboriginal populations, and meeting Nikita Khrushchev. While on his way to Moscow, he spoke about wanting to get involved in the rising American civil rights movement, but his wife told him she worried for his safety in the US. But then, tragedy would strike. After a wild party in Moscow, Robeson would lock himself in the bathroom and attempt to kill himself by slitting his wrists. When his son arrived, Paul explained that he had an unknown feeling of extreme paranoia and depression, with Paul Jr. claiming that his father was also paranoid back when he had to get a prostate surgery, even going so far as to claim that his father was subjected to mind depatterning under MK Ultra, and he spent the next 2 years heading to various clinics to treat him, each being a little less helpful than the last. All the while, US intelligence agencies were monitoring him, worrying what his death would do for his cause. He returned to the USA and started to take it easy, briefly getting in talks with Bayard Rustin and James Farmer to possibly get involved in the civil rights movement, but rising health concerns and their anti-communist stances made him decide to instead to seek permanent retirement. Not that long afterwards, Essie would pass away, leaving Paul to move in with other family members. However, Paul would get a little bit of a resurgence of popularity after his retirement, even having a tribute at Carnegie Hall to celebrate his 75th birthday, where he would send a taped message stating, "Though I have not been able to be active for several years, I want you to know that I am the same Paul, dedicated as ever to the worldwide cause of humanity for freedom, peace, and brotherhood." Paul would, however, end up passing away from complications of a stroke on January 23rd, 1976, at the age of 77. Robeson is a very fascinating figure, and hopefully you can kind of see why I chose him to be this year's representative of Black History Month, as I think Robeson very much perfectly exemplifies sort of the attitude of this month. Very active in causes that help the little guy, even when it put him at odds with a lot of other people. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, consider supporting me on Patreon.